All right, thank you all for coming this afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nancy Belafonte. I'm the librarian for undergraduate learning here at Drexel. And last Friday, for the first time, I attended a LAN party. I observed a LAN party. I didn't really play. But it was held at Bookmark Cafe, the library's Bookmark Cafe, on Friday. And 2 Drexel student organizations were in charge of this LAN party, Dragon LAN and TechServe. And it was a lot of fun, a great success. And so what we wanted to do was continue this theme of gaming communities and culture. And so we are very fortunate to have with us today Kevin Impellizeri to talk about his research. Kevin is a player, a collector, and a scholar of video games. He is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Delaware. The subject of his dissertation is the cultural history of video games in America, focusing on the changes in meanings of video game use and game users. Kevin is the author of the article, User Joystick 007, Video Games and the Interactive Bond Experience, published in the anthology James Bond and World in Popular Culture. He also writes game reviews and editorials for the website Meg Taco, and writes about video games, history, and technology on his blog, Primary Source Code. So welcome, Kevin, and thanks for being here today.
Before I get started, I just again want to extend a thanks to the staff of Drexel University Libraries for giving me the opportunity to talk to you guys today. Video games are something that's really close to my heart, and I assume it's close to a lot of you as well. And so I hope that my talk will help raise some really interesting issues and help for a lively discussion. The way I see this going, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my research. It should go no more than about 30 minutes. And then we'll open the floor to questions and discussions. So I really look forward to hearing your thoughts on the subject and really hope that we can have an interesting discussion about it. So the title of my presentation is Have Fun While Avoiding Your Warranty, Video Game Homebrewing and the Bally Professional Arcade. I'm using a very broad definition of homebrewing to include hacking, modding, anything that involves software or hardware modification regarding games. But we'll go into a little more than that as we go. So here we go. In early January 2011, internet hacker George Hotz, aka GeoHot, released on his website the security code for Sony's PlayStation 3. A code that allowed users to bypass the system's restrictions on software and allowed users to install and run their own programs or operating systems on the PS3. The release of the code was especially appealing to users interested in restoring the PS3's other OS feature, which allowed users to install their own operating systems such as Linux onto the PS3. The feature had been a marketing point for Sony prior to the system's release. However, in April 2010, an update of the system's firmware resulted in the feature being completely disabled. In response to this reveal, Sony Computer Entertainment America, the California-based arm of the Japanese-based software company, filed suit against Hotz, citing piracy and copyright infringement among other offenses. Poised to make an example of them, Sony filed a restraining order against Hotz and intended to bring the New Jersey native to trial in California. In March, Sony obtained a subpoena to seize records of all visitors to Hotz's website who may have accessed the code that he put up there, as well as donors to his PayPal account, which he established to cover his legal expenses. Hotz and Sony, they did ultimately settle on March the 31st, 2011, bringing to end 4 acrimonious months of saber-rattling, freestyle rapping, as you can see George Hotz there, and intense debates over issues of free speech, piracy, ownership, copyrights, and intellectual property among pundits, developers, hackers, and gamers alike. Under the settlement, Hotz was required to consent to a permanent injunction against hacking the PS3. And as I said, the case between Hotz and Sony really calls attention to complex issues in electronic games, including free speech, piracy, and ownership. I'm going to raise a couple of questions here. I will repeat them at the end to open up some discussion, but some of the questions we're going to go over are, who really owns a video game or system? The people who buy it, both the software and the hardware, or the companies that create them? Concerning ownership, who has the power to determine what one can do with them? What practices are deemed then appropriate or inappropriate usage, and who sets those boundaries? can users do whatever they want with them. For example, open up a game system and repurpose it for other things, modify game code, or develop their own programs to use on video game hardware, mod or hack games to do other things. Or should video game companies place restrictions on what people can do with them? These questions about use, function, and ownership and user agency have been further complicated with the emergence of a web-based digital games market, i.e. Steam or iTunes, especially as some companies begin to sell licenses rather than actual games and employ digital fail-safes such as digital rights management issues such as DRM. I'm sure the Diablo players in the room know about that DRM all too well at this point. Video game producers, in fact, are able to dictate usage by design, implicitly setting boundaries on what users can and cannot do with them. In an effort to discourage hardware modification, producers can, first of all, make it difficult or impractical to access a system's internal components by hiding screws, or possibly even using screwage not available to consumers. And as I cite for an example here, this is the Xbox 360 Slim. If you have it at home, I'd recommend taking a look and see if you can find any of the screws on it to open the thing up. Microsoft has made it very difficult for you to open one of these kinds of things up. Or another example that's not quite a video game system, look at the iPad. The idea is that it's sleek, it's self-contained, and the idea is that all of the business that goes on inside is really none of the user's concern. So that's one of the measures that they use to sort of curtail and also steer the way usage would be on one of these systems. Other things they might do is employ fail-safes that either block online play if the system has been modified, or even break the entire system. In other words, just completely disabling its uses. And unauthorized software usage can be then construed as tampering, which can then be retaliated by these kinds of measures, or more punitive and litigious responses, as Sony did with George Hotz. However, despite these kinds of restrictions, users do play an active role in setting the terms of their usage. As Hotz and others before him have demonstrated, all the fail-safes and legal threats that a company can produce will not prevent some users from playing with their games and systems the way they want to. There is yet to exist an unhackable system. The PS3 was supposed to be unhackable, and George Hotz disproved that. And some have discovered ways to alter or redesign game-related artifacts as they see fit. And so the rest of this paper will discuss the negotiation of those kinds of communities, focusing on one particular community. My paper examines the hobbyists, homebrewers, hackers, and other independent tinkerers who modify, alter, and repurpose video game hardware to suit their needs. These actions can be as simple as altering equipment to make gameplay easier to perform, such as the famous rock band sock mod, where in an effort to reduce the noise that the original rock band drums did, people would stretch tube socks over the actual hats on the drums. They can also be, as it says, simple as altering equipment to completely redesigning hardware, as in the case of this Xbox 360 repurposed to look like R2-D2, or creating entirely new games, such as the famous GoldenEye Source, which is a complete modification of Valve's Half-Life 2 to play the N64 game GoldenEye 007. Simultaneously acting as video game producers and consumers, these kinds of users blur the distinction between the two, as they use these consumer goods that they purchase to suit their own needs and to create their own uses for. Meanwhile, mainstream producers have to negotiate how to deal with these bodies of users, an issue we will get back to in a few moments. So for the next half hour or so, I will talk about one particular user community, focused around one particular video game system. One that you might not have heard of, and I would love a show of hands to see if anybody has heard of this, the system known as the Bally Professional Arcade. It went by many names. It was the Bally Professional Arcade, the Bally Home Library Computer. Later in its life, it was called the Astrocade. Show of hands, anybody who's heard of this system before? Okay, it's not one that a lot of people have heard of. It's sort of a very limited audience who's heard of it. Mostly because the arcade is often looked upon by video game historians as a footnote in the history of the industry when it's mentioned at all. It was not a wide commercial success. It produced very few memorable titles. And it hasn't really gained that level of popular nostalgia bestowed upon some of its contemporaries, most significantly the Atari video computer system known now as the Atari 2600. Nevertheless, the arcade earned a cult following from users interested in using the system to make their own hardware and software and learn about computerized technology. These people opened these systems to play with its internal components, manipulated its basic programming language, and created and distributed new hardware and software, gathering together in user clubs and through the pages of nationally circulated and locally circulated newsletters to exchange and develop meaning for their usage. And this kind of usage really extended beyond things that were intended or envisioned by the initial producers, Bally, and then later the company Astrovision/Astrocade. Moreover, when the channels of production stalled or ceased from these companies, these users assume roles typically considered to be the job of the companies, at times becoming the chief source of new content, new hardware, new software, and also at times becoming the primary driving marketing force for the Bally Professional Arcade. In doing so, they achieved a level of influence over the production and consumption of the arcade that users at other systems of the time could not have achieved. In fact, the relationship between the arcade homebrewers and hackers with the producers of it would really come as a surprise to their present-day counterparts. It is a relationship that George Hotz and the corporate interests at Sony, for example, would have found unfathomable. So my presentation, just to give you a map of what we're going to be going to from now, is first I'm going to give you an abbreviated history of the Bally Professional Arcade as a game system, sort of the corporate history of it. Next I'll examine the user community that developed around the arcade, going beyond the considerations of commercial success and failure. As I said, the arcade is typically considered a commercial failure, to examine the ways these users appropriated the arcade to suit their needs. And in doing so, I hope to call attention to the ways they view the system as well as themselves. And in this section, I'll also pay special attention to two specific artifacts related to the arcade. The first is Bally Basic, which was a cartridge that allowed users to program and develop their own software through the arcade using the basic programming language. And the second one is the add-on component, a hardware expansion unit that was to attach to the Bally that would expand its memory capabilities, as well as give it a number of other different features as well. It was initially promised by Bally, but then was never released, and ultimately the users ended up designing their own. And finally, I will briefly examine the interactions between the user community and one of the producers of the arcade, namely Astrovision, to enumerate the unique role that these homebrew players played in the production and marketing of the arcade. So let's go into a brief history of this system. During the 1970s, Bally Manufacturing Corporation was a major player in the coin-operated amusement industries. They were the chief supplier of slot machines to Las Vegas casinos, and they also had an arm of the pinball machine business. By the middle of the decade, the company decided to expand its reach into the developing electronic games business, with Bally's first commercial success being a game called Gunfight, a Wild West-style shooting game they released in 1975. In 1977, in an effort to capitalize on two emerging markets, television-based electronic games, such as the Pong variants that were released for home televisions, and as well as home computers, which were emerging at the same time. So in an effort to capitalize on them, Bally established a consumer products division with the intent to release their own home computer game system. And on July the 5th, 1977, Bally filed a patent for what they called a TV game apparatus. And soon after, the company reached an agreement with Illinois-based mail order firm JS&A to distribute and market their new game system. So this is an image of what they were patenting with a gunfight being played on the proposed screen. And so in September and October 1977, JS&A printed a series of two-page advertisements in several nationally circulated newspapers and periodicals such as Scientific American and the Wall Street Journal, introducing readers to what was then called the Bally Home Library Computer. The outriders were far from bashful on the subject of the home library computer's significance to consumers. Quote, "This is the story of an incredible product, so incredible that we know of no future consumer product that will have such a far-reaching impact on society," end quote. More than a mere TV game apparatus, the broadly worded ad promised the system was capable of accomplishing a wide variety of tasks, from teaching children mathematics to arcade-quality gameplay to managing a store's inventory and payroll. It also held out the promise of an array of accessories to expand the system into a full-fledged computer, including a full keyboard, a modem that could theoretically connect to JS&A's headquarters for placing orders for equipment in an early version of online shopping, including also a printer and a memory expansion unit, and that's the add-on component I'll be talking about in a few minutes. Bally's magical computer game system was scheduled for release later that year. However, delays followed, partly because of FCC regulations, and also Bally took their time on producing this thing. And ultimately, the home library computer did not really reach consumers until early 1978, when it had been renamed the Bally Professional Arcade. Several factors, however, ultimately undermines the arcade's chances of success. First of all, and very importantly, it suffered from a severe design flaw that caused it to overheat. Some of its key circuitry on the board, on the internal board, was located directly under this 24-pin keypad, which really made it very hard to keep it ventilated. As a result, it was really easy for it to overheat, and prolonged usage would make the system short out and eventually just stop working entirely. In fact, users of the Bally Arcade soon found that you actually cannot play this on a carpet. Because for those of you who know about the Xbox 360's Red Ring of Death, this will seem very, very similar. And even now, if you look on websites like Bally Alley, which is a present-day user community, they tell you don't play it on a carpet because it'll burn it out. In fact, I've heard from one user, this is something, the failure rate was something like 1 in 3. It was ridiculously high. That's one of those things that really undermines it. This is a comment from one of the users about the overheating issues of the Bally Arcade. This was in a newsletter called Cursor. Moreover, in addition to this overheating issue, Bally's choice of price to price the arcade at $300 left it really at the higher end of video game systems. It was expensive when it came out compared to other ones. For example, the Atari 2600 came out for $200, so significantly higher than that. And while it was inexpensive by contemporary computer standards, for example, the TRS-80 and Apple II, both released in 1977, cost $400 and $1,300 respectively. However, those promised accessories I just mentioned never materialized, and so as a result, it was left at a certain degree of technological disadvantage compared to its competitors. And as I said, as a video game system, it was overshadowed by Atari. Atari had a cheaper product. It had a much bigger library. It had bigger licensing ties with other games. It had Space Invaders, which in 1978 was the biggest game that had ever come out. So a lot going against the Bally Arcade when it comes out initially. And so as a result, these missteps really soured Bally's long-term commitment to this system. Furthermore, the legalization of casino gambling in Atlantic City, New Jersey in 1978 caused Bally to really reorganize its priorities away from consumer electronics and toward building casinos along the Jersey Shore. You probably all know about Bally casinos. Those are the ones that are built instead of marketing the Bally. Overall, Bally's handling the arcade really points to a lack of clear vision for what the company really saw the system doing, who it was targeted at, or really what the long-term goal of the consumer electronics actually were. In a 2011 interview, Jeff Fredrickson, who was the chief engineer of the arcade, recalled, quote, "The Bally execs said there was no future in home computing," end quote, calling it probably their biggest blunder. In 1980, Bally sold the rights to the arcade to Astrovision for a reported price of $2.3 million. At this point, reports had indicated that between 1970 and 79, Bally had lost $10 million on the arcade. The small Columbus, Ohio-based company sought to enter what was then rapidly becoming an increasingly booming video game industry. And rather than presenting the arcade and its ability to balance budgets or help in inventories, Astrovision focused more specifically on gaming. In March 1982, Astrovision launched a $10 million advertising campaign, rechristening the system the Astrocade, also changing the company's name to Astrocade in an effort to make things confusing for history writers everywhere. One promotional video targeted at retailers boasted, quote, "This year look forward to more excitement, more challenges, and more fun with Astrocade, the home entertainment sensation," end quote. However, the only sensation Astrocade really caused was becoming swept up in the rapidly receding tide of an oversaturated video game industry that by 1982 had begun to teeter on the brink of collapse. What came to be known as the video game crash was fueled by an overabundance of games, marketing everything from films like E.T. the Extraterrestrial to the Chuck Wagon from the Purina dog food commercials. Moreover, it was a crowded market. When Astrocade launches their ad campaign in '82, they're competing with 6 other video game systems. Compare that to today, where it's a 3, and at one point was a 2-system market throughout the 1990s and 2000s. And so as a result, they lose a lot of money very quickly. And so by the end of 1982, they're really suffering. In fact, in October of that year, Dan Dorfman of the Chicago Tribune described Astrocade Inc. as, quote, basically insolvent with a negative net worth of $1 million. As a result, in December of that year, Astrocade filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. They emerged from bankruptcy proceedings in March of 1984 to a depressed games market. At this point, that the boom had finally gone bust. The industry had collapsed. And also their retail connections had completely dried up while they had restructured. They lost all those connections. They hadn't been making games while they were restructuring. They tried to attempt to soldier on with an inexpensive version of the arcade marketed at a European market. However, it wasn't enough to save the company, and they finally folded in late 1984. So that's just a basic overview of the system. So let's go into a little bit about the user community. So if the arcade was such a commercial failure, where did the users fit in this picture? And as I said earlier, two artifacts helped to shape this role of the users in the life of the arcade. Bally Basic and the arcade component. The add-on, which appeared in JSNA's early ads as a sign the home computer was a wise investment, was a unit that physically connected the home computer, which included full keyboard, expanded memory, and had a built-in programming language that allowed users to develop their own software. In 1978, as production delayed on the add-on, Bally released Bally Basic, a cartridge that plugged into the arcade that allowed for programming in basic computer languages, basic computer language. It also came with an instruction manual introducing users to programming, and also an attachment that allowed users to store or load programs via cassette tapes. So let's stop for a minute about the Bally and take an aside and talk about really why Basic is important here. Basic is short for Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code. It was developed in 1965 by a pair of Dartmouth mathematicians who wanted to develop a computer programming language that was more accessible to non-users. Show of hands, anybody who's actually used BASIC before? When I was in grade school, it was the first language they showed us. So basically, for those who don't know about it, BASIC uses very, very simple languages like load and run and go to as a way of programming, and really became popular in computer science programs as an early introductory course before you lead people into more complex languages like Fortran or COBOL. But in addition to that, it was also very small programming language. You could fit on computers that had very limited capacities. And as a result of that, it really became popular among early computer hobbyists because it could fit on small computers. The Altair, the first mass-marketed home computer, only had 256 bytes of memory, and it had a variant of BASIC on it. So for arcade users, the prospect of learning a programming language through Bally Basic made the system an attractive item. This new idea, this new concept of computer programming, they have a way of getting into that now. And one such user was a man named Bob Fabris, who was an engineer working for Lockheed Missile and Space Company living in San Jose, California. He was an early adopter of the arcade. He saw it in the Scientific American in 1977, one of the early buyers from JSNA. He's a hobbyist. He enjoys a lot of other things. He enjoyed model railroad making, for example. And he finds a bunch of other like-minded individuals who want to be programmers, and they decide to form a user group. So they get together, and in November the 6th, 1978, he creates and distributes a newsletter for this community called Arcadian. Arcadian was designed really as sort of a way of introducing people to programming, into the Bally, and give people a forum by which they could communicate. As he explained in the November 1980 issue, quote, "The underlying reason for the paper is to help all understand how and why the machine operates the way it does. We can then make it operate the way we want it to, and we can expand its usefulness." Fabris sold Arcadian on a subscription basis based on year. He ran roughly about 11 to 12 issues a year, except for the last years where he only ran it as a quarterly. And this was circulated, I don't have exact circulation figures, but people across the country and in other countries such as Canada were subscribers to Arcadian. So Arcadian provided an organizing point for members of this user community and a means of really them getting together. And one of the things Fabris did is he encouraged users to submit news regarding local user chapters and encouraged those people who didn't have one near them to start their own. And one of the biggest and most influential ones was founded in 1980 called the Michigan Bugs, Bugs being short for Bally User Group. It was formed by a couple of programmers in Michigan and really became one of the bigger groups. And this is a flyer for one of their big gatherings called Astro Bash. And so, independent of Bally and Astrovision, these users developed their own networks of technological instruction and support, and Arcadian and other newsletters like Cursor assisted inspiring programmers' efforts to teach themselves about computer hardware and software. In this respect, the user community really became a network of shared instruction. One of the things that Arcadian was known for and encouraged was for people to submit their own codes. And so, for example, this is someone who was submitted in 1979 their sample for a particular program that they coded in Bally Basic. One of the more pleasant aspects in producing this newsletter, Fabris wrote in June 1981, is, quote, experiencing the expansion of our capabilities. We're all learning together, and this education is one of the major reasons for Arcadian, end quote. And so as users devise new methods of manipulating Arcade's hardware and software, some submitted tutorials, documented methods, and several regular contributors provided articles displaying their findings and techniques, and also as methods of navigating Bally Basic's very limited 1.8K memory capacity. Others, and this is one of the games that made for it, it's not out of order, others devised different hardware modifications, such as trying to deal with the overheating issues, and things like this. The Bally didn't have, any indication when the power was on, so this person recommended a way of installing an LED light onto a Bally arcade. So some contributors viewed homebrewing in the arcade really, in addition to instruction, as a means of innovation and discovery. In this sense, contributors to Arcadian and similar newsletters viewed themselves as explorers, examining the uncharted territory of the arcade's hardware and software. For example, one user, during the transition from Bally Basic to Astro Basic, an updated version of it, noted that there were loss of certain features in it, but didn't see that as a deterrence for programmers, saying, quote, now we had a machine that could tape fast enough to efficiently use file searching, we no longer had it, the feature had been removed. But that never stops a true pioneer and inventor. Who was it that said, if it can be done, it has, if it can't, it will be? Well, I'm ready to believe that anything can and will be done in the arcade given time. Things that we thought couldn't be done are being done every day. And so as users learn the system's eccentricities and capabilities, some viewed programming basic as a point of entry into the computing and video game businesses. Bally Basic and its successors, such as Astro Basic and Extended Basic and the use of machine language, allowed users to store data on portable cassette tapes, providing a means through which programs could be circulated among other users. And so this prompted some users to create programs for commercial sale, going back to the one that I just missed. This is one of them. As a result, a number of third-party developers emerged among the user community. These people, they created and sold games, publishing advertisements in newsletters such as Arcadian and Cursor. Some were original programs, such as George Moses' music program here. I'm going to soldier on just so we get everything in, and I'll show it at the end. But he, instead of making it for games, and not everybody necessarily made them for games, he decided to use it as a music synthesizer and released cassette tapes of the Bally playing various songs, such as Christmas music for Christmas time. He also did Scott Joplin and other greatest hits. At the end of this, when we're done, if there's time, the soundbite I was going to play, he also did one of the Beatles' greatest hits. So I have one of him doing a Bally Basic rendition of Paperback Writer. Other things they did was also versions of games that were popular at the time. This is also another homemade program called Tic-Tac-Tola. What also became popular among them was to make variations of arcade games that were popular at the time. And one of the most popular one for imitation in the pages of Arcadian was Pac-Man. There were tons of Pac-Man variations, from Micro Pac to NamCap. This one is interesting because they made it as backward. They have instead of eating dots, he spits them out now. To Maze Man. And also to other licensed titles that they made variations as well, such as LT, Little Terrestrial.
Is that any good?
I haven't played it. From the images, there's no way that it can be worse than ET. And it looks like, at least from the images, that it's better than that. And so as the arcade faced commercial apathy by Bally and sort of financial woes by Astrovision, this network of third-party users and programmers really became the primary means for people to get new content for the Bally. They either would buy them from these third-party users, maybe they're really interested in getting LT to see if it is worse than ET, or they would program them themselves. And near the later parts of Astrovision's financial woes, the users decide not only are they going to make games, they're going to make cartridges. And this is a big deal, as in 1982 they started developing a means of doing that, because before that they were making them with cassettes. And cassettes had a lot of inherent problems. Again, has anybody used data storage on cassettes? I'm unfortunately making you guys show your age a little bit. And you guys probably know some of the problems of working with cassettes. First of all, the cassettes, the tape deteriorates relatively easily. If you want to run a program, you got to make sure it's in the exact right spot to play it. It takes time to store or load programs from. And in addition to those problems that are endemic of cassette storage, if you were a user of the Bally Arcade, you needed Bally Basic or Astro Basic or another variation of it as a means of running those programs. What putting them on a cartridge does, and allowing you to directly plug it into the Astrocade, allowed you to do is that you didn't need all that. It was plug and play. It would play on its own. And what this does is it makes it possible for these third-party companies to make a more wide distribution to users who don't necessarily, are not necessarily as tech-savvy as they are. And so trying to market this at a larger audience, and really at a time when, at this point, Astrocade's not making anything. So they become the primary source of content for this system now. And so this is really there's no alternative to this. So that becomes a very significant element of the Bally Arcade and this user community, because then they become this sort of supply chain for games. The second one is going to the add-on component. As I mentioned, the add-on component was supposed to expand the memory capabilities of the system, and this really became a big thing for arcade users because of those limited memory capacities of the 1.8K memory of Bally Basic and things. So they tried to figure out ways to expand the system's memory. And what had been promised in the late 1978 and 79, 77, 78, and 79 by JSNA and Bally ultimately never materialized. Their version of the add-on, which is this from 1978, never came to. There were a lot of promises of it, but it never came to fruition, despite a lot of users really holding out hope that it would come out. And so despite demonstrating a prototype at the 79 Consumer Electronics Show, Bally never released this. And Astrovision displayed their own version of the add-on at the 1981 Consumer Electronics Show, but that never came to fruition either. And so as a result, impatient users had to explore their own alternatives. In July of 1979, Bob Fabris encouraged readers to develop a homebrew version of the add-on, and two memory expansions ended up emerging from the user community. The first of which was this one here, released in 1980. This is the Blue RAM. The Blue RAM attached, there was a 50-pin connector that was in the back of the, basically this big connector for expansion in the back of the arcade, and this plugged in directly to it. It was created by a gentleman named John Perkins, who was really active in that Michigan Bugs community I told you about. He had an engineering firm in Boise City, Michigan. And the Blue RAM attached to the arcade and expanded the system's usable memory to 4K. He sold the Blue RAM via mail order through arcading, either as a kit for users to assemble or as in a prepackaged unit, selling them for $130 and $170 respectively. And eventually he released expanded versions of the Blue RAM that expanded memory to 16K and 32K, and then eventually developed a keyboard. The second one that came out was released the following year by a Maine-based company called Alternative Engineering, called the Viper System 1, which was also available via mail order through the Arcadium. It was more expensive than the Blue RAM, selling at $225, but it expanded the Bally's RAM to 16K and ROM to 24K. And Alternative Engineering also sold a keyboard. I will point out, I guess, one thing about this. I mean, it does expand the memory. It's a very big, cumbersome system, though, I'd say. Imagine this sitting in your living room. The Bally itself is about that big, so the Viper is about double. So basically, if you want to attach them all, it's about this big sitting on your sitting in your living room. And of course, you can't keep that on. You could keep it on the carpet because the Bally is elevated. So these various versions come out as a response to Bally and Astrovision not releasing their add-on component. And in fact, it attracted the attention of Astrocade. And in May of 1983, the cash-strapped company, still in bankruptcy court, sold the rights to produce the add-on to Alternative Engineering. And so they developed something called the Z-Grass Viper. Z-Grass named after the Z-Grass programming language, which was going to be included on it, which purportedly had 64K RAM, 32K ROM, 2 expansion ports, 2 cassette input-output ports, a keyboard, and a 4-channel disk drive controller. So a lot of capabilities for this. It was reportedly going to be released in July of 1983. The deadline came and went. A deadline in September that year came and went, and that one didn't come out. And ultimately, this also never came out, and alternative engineering folded along with Astrovision. So these are just some examples of the interaction between the user community and the companies, mainly Astrocade. They also had other different interactions. One thing is, for example, after Astrovision purchased the rights to the system, they sent representatives to meet with some of the user groups. And these are some pictures from the Michigan Bugs meeting with representatives from Astrovision. And there was a lot of cooperation to a level that would be very surprising, I think, now. Several members of the user community were hired by Astrovision to make games for them. George Moses, who made the music program, was commissioned to make a music maker cartridge, characteristic of Astrovision, that never came out. There was a lot of this participation. They helped out with marketing. Members would show off their programs and things like Consumer Electronics, show demonstrations of it, and other kinds of interactions like that. Well, when Astrocade folds in 1984, of course, that collaboration ceases. But what does happen is the members decide to try to take up the system and keep it going on their own, if for no other reason than to keep the lifespan of the system going until another buyer can take up the Astrocade and save it in the way that Astrovision did. They continue to produce games, as I mentioned, the cartridges. They print advertisements in video game magazines such as Electronic Games in hopes of really drumming support to the Astrocade. However, by 1985, and at that point the Astrocade had folded, the system had really run its course. It was beginning to show its age. I mean, at this point, this is a system that was supposed to come out in 1977, competing with new computers and game systems that are coming out now. And even the most dedicated fans began to lose interest. One disillusioned user placed an ad in the October 1984 issue of Arcadian, offering for sale his entire collection, including 2 arcades, full runs of Arcadian cursor newsletters, and over 200 cassette-based programs under the headline, quote, "I gave up," on the ad under, the name of the ad on. And in March of 1984, the Michigan Astrobugs, the most active user group, they fold, and Arcadian folds 2 years later. So they were able to maintain it for a short amount of time, but without a big corporate backing, they could not keep it going on forever. And this is another thing that the users also did. Astrovision would send them advanced copies of games, and occasionally do beta testing, as they do with Astro Basic, which is an expanded version of the Bally Basic. But this time, that attachment that the element had to go to a cassette player is gone with a direct connection port right on the unit itself. So let's wrap things up here. Video game modification, be it creating and distributing new or modified software or altering and manipulating hardware, really blurs the line between production and consumption. Users are participating in these activities, and the networks of users in which they share and discuss their handiwork really make use of consumer goods produced by others. However, they examine and modify these artifacts to suit their own needs. Some play multiple roles, as I said with the Bally user group, as designers, marketers, consumers, testers, technicians, engineers, developers, all those things. And while this is seldom in the primary activity of video game users, most of them use it just for playing games, grassroots hardware and software modifications like this have a really long history. And in turn, producers' development decisions have really been shaped by this kind of grassroots user community, either collaborating as Astrocade did with the Bally user community, or attempting to curtail it, as we saw at the beginning with GeoHot. And so while homebrewing has often been associated with web-based communication, what I'm going to leave you on here is the fact that this has really gone on even before the internet. And many are used to communicating on message boards, things like Lifehack and things like that, and trying to find modifications. Arcade demonstrates this practice, again, has a long history. And the producers and consumers have maintained a complex negotiation over what the notions of function and ownership are regarding video game usage. So, and those who haven't seen already, this is the Nintoaster, which is basically the guts of a Nintendo Entertainment System housed in a toaster. There's also a Super Nintoaster, which is the Super NES. So I thank you all for hearing my presentation. I apologize if it's gone a little long, but I hope that now we can open up the floor to discussion, talking about any questions you guys have, or just any issues you want to discuss.
Are you uploading this presentation somewhere?
I could, if you'd like.
Maybe. Could there be arrangements so it can be uploaded to the library website?
I would have to talk to the library people about that. They say, I get a thumbs up in the back.
I see that.
Any other questions?
I thought it was really interesting, and I like that it wasn't just a trip down nostalgia lane of look at these funny old game systems, but that you really explore the networks of these gamers and home brewers. So what were the means of communication? Was it all mail-based
It was
newsletters?
mail, the phone, and there's a real rudimentary internet called the SourceNet, I think it's called, which some of the members had. Bob Fabris, the guy who founded Arcadian, had this. I think one or two of the other bigger programmers in the community had them. But mostly either that it was done by word of mouth or on the phone or via mail. So I thought I'd raise the floor to some discussion, not just necessarily directly related to the Bally Arcade, but I thought I'd go back to some of those questions that I raised at the beginning of the presentation, and maybe I'd really love to hear your guys' thoughts on this. So let's go back to the first question I asked at the beginning. Who really owns a video game system? The people who buy them or the companies that create them?
That's a tough question. I mean, I would assume that because I purchased it, it's mine to do with what I would like to do with it. I mean, if I buy a car to drive in the city, why wouldn't I be able to drive that one day out in the country, as opposed to, you know, say the car, it's not up to the car manufacturer to tell me where I can and cannot drive my car. I mean, obviously, if the car's not designed to go off-road, I'm not going to take it off-road, but that's because it's designed that way. If the game is capable of being modded, then I don't see why there would be such an issue.
Any other thoughts?
Have any of you done that? Any of you that are active gamers now?
Well, some games actually, they promote modding the video games.
So this is the game as opposed to the hardware.
Yeah, well, I guess. I've never really modded consoles, but computers are another example, other than the car example. Computers, I can buy the pieces, I put the computer together, that's mine to do with what I want. If I buy a power supply for computer, why can't I use that same power supply in a server later on down the road? It's not up to the company, it's just the company makes the power supply, and then I buy the power supply, I do with what I want. Now going to the software, there's games like Skyrim made by Bethesda that has an entire software that users can use free of charge to mod the game in any sort of way, and then takes it to the next level where you can share it with other users and they can download your mods and everything like that. So,
Well, aren't there ways to make your source code like open source, like coding, like open source, like kind of like a Creative Commons for programming? I don't know a lot about it, but
Yes, are you referring to, well,
I don't know.
okay, most
I mean,
commercial
you can
games,
put a license to your software, or you can just literally freely distribute it. Basically, okay, it's here, do with it what you want. Or you can make it open source, but put restrictions on it such that if, okay, well, it's open source, except for if you want to use it in a commercial environment,
Right.
in which case you have to pay us royalties. That's actually a problem that Apple ran into with OS X, where one of the systems that was used with OS X came from the Unix side. They changed the license on it and they couldn't use it anymore, and they had to build their own.
I mean, I think the whole idea like reusing, you know, the reuse culture is great. I do though think that there should be like options. I mean, this isn't really answering the question. I don't know enough about this area, but
There's no right answer to this.
but okay, good.
you're always wrong.
That's true. But I do think there's something about having creative, like having property and protecting your creativity, and not just having something so that people can't just come and modify it and then use it as their. I mean, I think there should be some control with the creator, like sort of like the options of having copyright versus Creative Commons.
I think one of the distinctions that comes up relatively early, although I don't know in the packaging of these games, I can't remember from my Atari games if there was any license on the cartridge that or any mention of licensing, but that hardware follows the for sale doctrine because you buy it, it's yours, you can sell it, you can throw it off something, you can do whatever you want with it. But with software, typically they tell you you're not buying it, you're licensing. You're licensing it to use, and even though that's something that's a subject of litigation over and over again, there hasn't been a fully conclusive decision based on
And it's getting worse and worse with more software, particularly video games, where you don't even buy a disc anymore. You just download it off of Xbox Live or something like that. Because then it's 10 times easier for Microsoft to take that away from you, and 10 times harder for you to maintain ownership of that. And I think especially as we move into digital realm, the same thing happens with ebooks and sort of thing. Do we own those? Who owns those?
I want to bring up, since you brought up ebooks, I want to bring up an incident on Barnes & Noble or Amazon, one of those ebook stores. They sold 1984 and some other books for ebook readers, and then it turns out they weren't supposed to be selling in the first place, so they revoked it and disabled it on all those ebook readers.
They didn't just disable it, they deleted it.
It
It's
deleted
gone.
itself.
They went on.
Yes.
Oh, it's like taking money out of your bank account.
They did refund them though.
Well, they got lucky because I've had many instances where there have been apps that I've downloaded from the App Store, and Apple was like, when they go to release an update, Apple's like, yeah, you can't kind of do that anymore, so you're getting pulled. Well, it's like, I just paid $25 for this app, and now I don't get it anymore.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't one of the EA games Guitar Hero for the iPhone? Didn't that have the same situation?
Yeah, just they official licensed EA game, and they just put a little message up for the iPhone users like you're not going to be able to play this anymore.
It was a version of Rock Band.
Oh, Rock Band. Yeah, it's
they just took the
still
license
available.
to buy.
Still available to buy. Like you would purchase it, download it. By the way, in about 7 days, you're not going to be able to play this game anymore. But why even keep it on the marketplace?
They don't even have a
return
notification on
policy?
their notification on their store page.
The return policy with Apple is a very tricky business, and generally it's you have 24 hours to raise a dispute.
I mean, there can be.
And good luck actually getting in touch with someone.
And there can be. I find it's easier with music. With apps, it's almost impossible.
Yeah, music you can definitely, if you accidentally download a whole thing, Apple's very much, okay, yeah, you can refund it, we'll just revoke the DRM license that you have on it. Whereas with apps, it's like, maybe. It's dependent on if they're in a good mood or a bad mood.
Kevin, do you see many parallels between the way that people are so quick to hack e-readers? For instance, a new Nook version or Kindle version comes out, people are flashing new ROMs and trying to make them do things they weren't designed to do, and gaming consoles.
Well, I mean, I haven't looked too much into e-readers to sort of to put that out there. I notice it in most kinds of hardware like this, especially if you tell like users that you can't do something, then they're going to like. I think the way Sony handled this is if nothing else, it's going to encourage more people who are doing this. After their whole deal with GeoHot, they basically said that the Vita was going to be inaccessible to homebrewers. I don't know if they've jailbroken it yet, but
I don't think so.
I think that's only a matter of when they're going to do that.
Yeah, I think Sony's having a popularity problem with it.
I think even if it fails, eventually someone will figure it out, and then Sony just won't care anymore. But it's that whole where's a will, there's a way kind of thing. If someone wants to do it, I mean, the whole thing before the PS3 was that the iPhone was unhackable. And actually George Hott, the guy I mentioned at the beginning, also hacked the iPhone. And the whole big thing, as I said, with the PS3 was that it was unhackable. So I think if to use the ebooks, I'm sure people have found ways and they're out there looking for ways.
What's the retail price of the Vita?
It depends on what model you get in the U.S. For the Wi-Fi model, I believe it starts at $250 before tax.
Something like that, yeah.
An ebook reader's at around $50 or $60 to start with. The barrier of entry is a lot lower, right? And if you brick it, you're out a lot less.
Yeah, you don't have to worry about voiding your warranty if it's only house time.
Well, and there's talk that in the fall, Apple's going to release a smaller, more attainable iPad that's about the size of a Kindle and going to start at $250. So you know, it would be interesting to see if once that happens, if that happens, if there's going to be a lot more hacking on Apple, on iPads and stuff. Because I have a feeling that one of the reasons why there's not as much hacking on it, there's still hacking on iPads, but not as much is because you spend $800 on this thing, you don't want to wrap it.
And Apple's interesting in that regard. I mean,
Well, the other problem is the iPad actually also has very different code, and it's actually slightly harder to hack.
Yeah. It's also harder to get into physically if you actually want to
Oh,
hardware.
forget it. The iPhone, if you can get in the security screws, you can do whatever you want. The iPad, take a hammer and a crowbar, good luck.
that's a long history too. The Apple II was notoriously hard to get open. They pretty much made it was like poured plastic. They made it Apple made it very difficult to open one of those up without really causing damage to it.
Which is interesting, because then the Apple IIe was two little tabs at the back, just pop, and you have complete access to the entire thing.
I mean, even Apple's desktops, some of them are very notoriously hard to upgrade. In fact, I just recently installed a new SATA cable into my Mac Pro, and to do that I had to take my front fan out, which did not want to come out, so I think I spent a good 3 hours trying to pry it out before I could put one cable in.
So one thing that I looked at real quick, since I have my computer here and a library and weird that way, just the price at release of $300 comes out to just over $1,000 in today's money.
Expensive.
So one of the reasons why you continue to homebrew and hack something is that was a significant investment. So keeping it alive, makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, and that also becomes very problematic for Bally, especially when they consider making the add-on. The whole idea, their marketing initially was that this was an inexpensive but well put together computer. JSNA was very big on pushing the fact that this is a wise long-term investment. It's going to be cheaper than most other computers, and again, comparatively speaking, it was. I mean, it was $100 cheaper than the TRS-80, but the Bally didn't have a lot of the capabilities that the TRS-80 had, and it did have the same processor use, so but the whole problem then becomes is one of the reasons that I think they start wavering on the add-on is that when they get the estimates of how expensive this is going to be, at one point the add-on was clocked in at like anywhere between $450 and $600. So it was significantly more than the cost of the actual hardware it was supposed to run on. And that made JSNA, the marketing people, they actually ended up bailing on Bally because, first of all, Bally went to them and they said, we're not even sure we're going to make this, if at all, and if we do, it's going to cost $600. And so JSNA said, okay, thank you, we'll look elsewhere. In fact, they even sold off tons of their, like I said, the Bally had that terrible failure rate. They had a broken Bally sale where you could like enter in kind of a lottery and they'd sell you it for 2 cents or something. It's like a broken Bally. But yeah, that becomes a real dicey issue for computers at that time too, is because really 1977, it's not really, first of all, the fact whether or not computers are going to exist and succeed, and whether consumers are going to use them, whether I can run my presentation on there, that's still in flux then, and they're still really trying to figure out who computers are for and what they're going to do and what people are going to do with them. So you'll see a lot in advertisements at this time. Instead of all the stuff that the Bally could do, Apple had another one very famously said that Apple can go as far as your imagination can take it, kind of leaving what they could do open to the users and always letting them project what they want. It's like, well, what can computers do? Well, what do you want them to do? And they'll do that. I had to like track. Apple had tracking bioreaders and things on your iPad too. So it comes out at a really interesting time for computers, both in terms of how much are people willing to pay for whatever this is, and what is it actually going to do.
Is this still an active community? I mean, are there still people who collect these things and who still try to program them, like people tinker on old cars and stuff?
I'm very glad you asked that. Because, I don't know if you noticed throughout the presentation, I have these sources called Bally Alley. Bally Alley is basically the modern adaptation of Arcadian. They're a newsletter-based organization on the web. It actually was founded by this guy who's interested in obsolete technology named Adam Triumpho, who got he actually picked up a Bally at like a yard sale or something and got involved and found on the internet a bunch of the guys who were involved in Arcadian, and they started a newsletter and they started sending him stuff. Just tons of full runs of Arcadian old games. All this material is related to the Bally. And so he digitized it and he put it on a website. So if you wanted to check any of the stuff that I put on here, is all available online at ballyalley.com. And you can check all kinds of stuff that they have available for this. And they do have an active user community. They do Yahoo groups, which I was just so surprised. I didn't think anybody use Yahoo groups anymore. But they're very active. They still post. A lot of the old guys who were involved with this still do it. In fact, some of them are actually prominent technicians these days. Jeff Frederickson, the guy who designed it, works for Apple. And in fact, another guy who was a young programmer when this came out, was one of the founders of the Michigan Bugs, a guy named Brent Bilbrey, who was a senior technician for Apple and was one of the guys involved behind the iPad. So these guys, they get together, they still have like reunions and things. But yeah, it's something that's still going on. Some people still try to play with this. And it's like a lot of older game systems have these kinds of communities that still follow. I mean, in 2013, there's supposed to be a brand new cartridge released for the Super Nintendo. And if you go like on Atari fan sites, there are people who are still making 2600 cartridges and selling them to other users. So these kinds of things, they do grow legs. And the internet has really helped that because it makes it a lot easier than even the newsletters was to for these people to interact with each other.
I'm impressed they found each other using the newsletters. I mean, they were taking out ads of Popular Science, and that's how they were building their newsletter lists. And
they did that. And they also advertised in other game magazines. Like I mentioned, Electronic Games is really the first video game magazine. Sites like IGN, Escapist owe their lineage to Electronic Games, which was started in 1979. They put them out in there. There are magazines called Joystick and video games and things, and they put them in there. And then stuff gets traveled through word of mouth. People get together through different communities. You form a local group, and you know somebody who subscribed to Arcadia, and you subscribe, and so you tell two friends, they tell two friends, kind of thing. And yeah, it kind of goes from there.
Is there an emulator?
Is there an emulator? There is. I don't know if you've heard of the MESS emulator. The MESS emulator, for those who know, is kind of this mass emulator. It can emulate a number of different computer and video game systems. So there isn't like one for the arcade, and the only thing that's problematic about it is, as far as I know, it'll only run the commercial programs that Bally and Astrocade ran. It doesn't have a means, as far as I know, of running the old basic produced card cassettes. Which I think is, from what little I've read so far, the user group on Yahoo groups is kind of a bone of contention for them. It's really trying to figure out how to get around that.
Is an emulator? I'm sorry.
Oh, an emulator.
You don't have the Astrocade, or what?
An emulator is a computer program that basically tricks your computer into thinking it's this kind of game system, and you can run things called ROMs on it, which will run whatever program. In fact, the image I showed you at the beginning was an NES emulator that was put in an NES cartridge. And so you can, like, say if you wanted to run like an NES game, you can run this program on your computer and you can play that way. So yeah, there are, but a lot of the library is still kind of inaccessible. I'm pretty sure you can run it through if you've got that Astro Basic program I showed you with the socket in it, you can actually plug that into a CD player, and if you've got them onto a CD, they will run that way. It's actually apparently more. It's actually better than cassettes because they'll start right at the point where they're supposed to start.
Okay, so it's just supposed to play noise, and it goes into the jack, and then there's an ADC in there. How does that work?
Oh, how does it work transferring data between the cassettes?
Yeah. There was that audio jack.
Yeah. It did it through. I haven't done it myself. I'm sure I don't want to call attention to the more seasoned gentlemen. They probably have done more. They've certainly done more of it than I have.
There is an ADC that was built into the device. So basically, you played it, you just heard static. But it's similar to how the early 300 baud modems worked over the phone. And so if you bought a modem with the Apple II that I had, you would actually have to take your phone and put the handset of your phone into a device that had two little suction cups.
I've seen it in war games.
On a princess phone now.
But yeah, it plugged in. I'll bring up that Astro version.
Many of us in the room.
The way this worked is you plugged an audio jack into your audio plug into this. And the way you would run it is for input and output, you would plug it either into the headphone jack or the microphone jack. I think the output was the microphone jack, and the input was the headphone jack. Correct me if I'm wrong. And that's how you could store them. The cassettes were used really before floppy disks became popularized, and they're really trying to figure out a way of storing and transferring computer data. And so a bunch of systems tried to pitch for cassette-based storage. Mattel made for Intellivision. They were going to make an attachment where the whole thing was sat in and had a cassette-based storage. And Atari was supposed to make one. They didn't make one for the 2600, but I think they made one for some of their other units.
The 400.
For the 400. I think the Apple II was originally cassette-based. When it comes out in '77, they make it a disk drive based.
Also, do you know what the obstacle is to running user-made programs on that emulator? Is it a hardware thing, software?
I wouldn't know. I don't have the kind of technological expertise.
You just know there's some kind of obstacle.
If I were to guess, it's just I guess the physical. I think it might be the physical thing of how actually transferring them from a cassette to whatever. I don't know how they would do it with like sound files or whatever they would run it. As far as I know, they haven't figured out a way.
I'm gonna say my microphone jack in my laptop has a terrible SNA or SNR.
SNR.
Signal noise ratio.
Okay.
There's a lot of those. I don't think it will work there. I'm wondering how good was that hardware there that you would have enough signal and noise wouldn't interfere. Never mind.
They had a list of like recommended ones, and occasionally people would either in in Arcadian or more significantly in Cursor, this other newsletter. It was actually a for-profit newsletter that gets found. This guy thinks he's going to make a big business on this huge magazine he puts together. He has a 5-page newsletter that he wants to turn into this big magazine enterprise thing. And he's never able to meet his deadlines, and eventually it folds, and he leaves a lot of his subscribers holding the bag because he basically cuts it out a little bit. But that's not going there. But anyway, he markets in the pages of his advertisements for okay, this cassette player will work, this cassette player won't. It was like it had to be sort of like the higher quality, higher end cassette players for it to get you good sound, because again, eventually it deteriorated on you, and it became every time you used it, it's like with a record. Every time you use it, it makes it harder to retrieve the data again. It's not as you can guess, it's not a terribly reliable means of data storage, and that's why they start going to things more like floppy disk based.
Well, also, I noticed some of those ads for some third-party games. They were clones of more popular games, but they were selling them for $9 or so. Were there any issues they ran into for doing that?
That's an excellent question. I have no records of them ever reaching those kinds of legal, because it does raise a lot of legal and copyright issues. They're basically, some of these guys are basically just taking and repurposing these things and putting them on their own. I don't know, actually.
There were lawsuits, probably not for the Bally system, but for Apple software. There were some lawsuits, but I think at that point, the question of how strongly copyright applied to things like computer programs was a pretty open question. So there used to be a lot of kind of sort of really close things that you could get from the shareware community for Apple computers. In fact, a friend of mine and I worked on our own version of a game called Qubit, which we couldn't afford. So my friend who was better than I was and had a color monitor, we spent like a few weeks and we made our own version of the game, and gave it to our friends and stuff.
How much did it cost that you couldn't afford it?
It was probably not very much, but you have to remember that at the time I was like 10.
Which game was it?
Qubit. It was you had like a penguin, you were jumping down blocks of ice.
Qubit.
Qubit. Yeah.
Well, I guess at 10, yeah, it makes sense you would be able to afford a game. A modern console game costs $60 US. A 10-year-old, not all 10-year-olds can exactly afford it without saving for it. Saving allowance for some long period.
It used to be worse during the Genesis and Super Nintendo. They cost $70.
And that's before the economy.
So a $10 game in 1977 would cost $35 now.
And Atari games, I think, roughly ran about $30 then, if my memory serves.
And on modern console games, are they actually shrink wrapped, or you're downloading everything? And there's no media?
Plastic box, shrink wrap, but the digital downloads are mostly limited to games that are smaller in file size, older games that are ported to those newer consoles, indie games.
And
The large, big budget games, they're mostly in this form, unless it is a PC game, in which case it'll sometimes, often come in boxes, and also be available for digital download. A lot of them will only be available for digital download. No, most of them will have a box too.
And I ask because I wonder, can you still trade games or are they all DRM, so there's only a single user?
Oh yeah,
Most
you can still exchange. There's a very large, very robust used games market, and in fact, that's something that especially in recent years, the mainstream games industry has really tried to curtail. And part of the reason for some of those DRMs, in addition to curbing piracy, and they're really trying to make it harder for used games to be something that people can do. In fact, there's been some rumors. They're not confirmed yet because the systems haven't come out yet. But the newer versions of the newer version of the 360 may be all digital based, which it's still a rumor. It's still speculation now, but it has caused an uproar from some people. Like GameStop threatened that if that is, they wouldn't carry their games, they wouldn't carry their systems at all, because it's a large industry now, the secondhand business, and the industry is now really trying to curb that. That raises all other different issues of ownership. That can you not only use a product the way, can you sell it off to somebody else the way you want? That becomes a whole other thing. I mean, they used to do it for PC games. They probably said that they had a serial code that it came with, and that code was tied to that game. And if you didn't have that code, you couldn't play that game. There are ways around it. People found ways of crafting those codes, but they're trying to. I wouldn't be surprised if they try to do more stuff like that for console games. If anyone wants to add anything.
Okay, so
There's a lot to say about the music industry.
if the PC game was made in the last 7 years, maybe, I wouldn't bet on it. If it's on an online platform such as Steam, forget about it. It's gotten to the point where you have some indie games where they use DRM free as a bullet point, and it catches your attention. DRM free!
Right.
Such as, I don't suppose you've heard of the Humble Indie Bundle.
Right, you bid whatever you want for it, and the money go to charity or go to the developers.
I'd say their DRM free is less common, or it's pretty rare from what I've seen.
It's big in the indie market. The smaller developers tend to push themselves as DRM free because there's, some people have come around to DRM. I remember when Steam was it was a real big sticking point about the fact that it was DRM, and now people don't seem to care about that. It's more, it becomes cultured into it. Some of the bigger ones are DRM, the smaller ones are not necessarily. You can still get some PC games that don't need DRM.
Steam also has like great sales too. So
Yeah.
that's part of it. Like the costs, like I bought like newer games for like $5
Yeah.
on certain days. It's not a problem.
That helps too. When you make something within the reach of some people have argued that's the best way to curb piracy and use games to incentivize it. And Steam does a great job
Like
of that.
one day, they do that for one game.
And if you get a DRM game that costs you $2 and you don't like it, you're only at $2.
That was one question. That's okay. Someone else needs
We were talking about that before we were talking about Steam and how you can get like, I got a game for $1 or something.
Yeah, they actually their sales. They have sales pretty darn often. Every